My name is Lyle Birkin, and I heard of your YouTube page through a friend of mine. She told me you make videos on a lot of unsolved mysteries and that you have a large audience that gets personally invested in the stories that you tell. Well, if that is true, then I need your help with something. My story is an old one and one that not many folks are interested in hearing anymore, but if you can help me spread the word a little and rekindle a little interest in it, I think you and your viewers might finally be able to put an old and very painful mystery to bed for me. You see, all the way back in 1989, my little brother Jody had a nervous breakdown. His wife picked a lucky scratch off, then had some airtight divorce papers drawn up before she'd even cashed her winning. Because of the way the state law worked at the time, her unemployment status entitled her to more than half of their physical assets. Then after her fancy-pants West Coast divorce lawyer presented some overly exaggerated evidence of his drinking to the family court, she took the kids too. Jody then hired his own lawyers to try and overturn the court's judgment, spending almost every penny that he had left in the process. The bid failed, and after that, he was dead broke, and he spent a very long couple of months just wasting away in our spare bedroom. I remember at one point my eldest daughter asked my wife, "Mommy, what does Uncle Jody do?" My wife replied, "Uncle Jody's up there growing his beard, honey, and it's better he's left alone while he does it." Honestly, that just about summed it up for a while, until one day, Jody seemed to start getting better. Initially, I didn't question it. I was far too happy to see an improvement in him. But then, as time went by, I found myself wondering what his miracle medicine had been, just in case I needed a dose of it in the future. When I asked him what his secret was, he told me without a hint of irony, "This time next year, we're going to be multimillionaires." Naturally, I wanted to know what kind of scheme he was cooking up, and that's when he led me down the mother of all get-rich-quick rabbit holes. To help get his mind straight, Jody had started making daily visits to the local library. He said he liked the quiet, and I figured it was simply part of his new sober routine. But the more he read, the more he learned, and then after a while he began to fixate on something. I remember him taking me into our guest room to show me a bunch of maps and geology books. His explanation was manic and sort of fragmented, and he used a lot of terms like ley lines and tectonic plates and really weird ones like vibratory essences. I think he lost me after about 10 seconds of just talking, and I gave him at least another minute or so before I cut him off. He admitted that he didn't know exactly what he was looking for, nor did he know exactly where it was. All he knew is that it was somewhere out in eastern Arizona, near the San Carlos Apache Reservation. To say that I was in two minds about it would be the understatement of the century. On one hand, my brother was clearly obsessing over some crazy tinfoil hat pursuit, while on the other, the focus it gave him was making him better. He was showering every day, he'd quit drinking, he was going out and exercising. Why would I ever want to interrupt that? I figured my best bet was just to let him have his fun, keep an eye on him, and see how it all played out. Things went on that way for a while until one morning I asked my daughter to go wake Uncle Jody up to tell him breakfast was ready. Minutes later, she walked back into the kitchen and told me he was gone. His room was empty. All that remained of him was a handwritten note that he left on the dresser saying, "Gone to Arizona. I'll call when we're rich." That was June 12th of 1989, the last time I ever heard from my brother Jody. Since he hadn't left any way of contacting him, we still weren't entirely sure of his mental well-being, and I reported him missing in Virginia and Arizona. I even told them that Jody was almost certainly somewhere near the San Carlos, but neither state nor local police had ever found him. By the end of '89, law enforcement had all but given up on finding my brother, and aside from a handful of civilian volunteers, no one was looking for him anymore. I knew I had to take matters into my own hands, but there was no way in hell that I'd be able to find him on my own. Our parents had made Jody and I go to Boy Scouts when we were kids, and he excelled at it. I did not. I'd need help, serious help, and that's when Mr. Calder Hayes stepped in to offer his assistance. You see, Hayes was a self-proclaimed master outdoorsman, so he told me, and specialized in tracking down missing people in mountainous and woodland terrain. He'd worked with a few different police departments all over the country, and he had helped close one or two of those open cases in the process, so I gave him a call and explained our situation. He was a real straight shooter, though, and he told us that he'd work a week for free before asking for any payment. If he couldn't find Jody by then he wasn't in the area. So even if Jody wasn't found, we could at least eliminate the San Carlos as a search area. I took him up on the offer, thanking him from the bottom of my heart, and when I told my wife the news, she broke down into tears of gratitude. By the time Mr. Hayes arrived in Arizona, it was early February, and my wife and I had been in a state of panic for almost 8 months. We were exhausted, emotionally and physically, and our resolve was wearing very quickly. "If Jody wanted to be found, he'd have been found," my wife once said, and in many ways, she was right. But it was also her way of saying that there was a good chance that Jody was no longer with us. It was a thought that I couldn't bear to entertain, given how the last words I ever said to him was something to the effect of, "Get a job." I prayed he'd be found, so I wouldn't have to spend the rest of my life knowing that I'd missed the chance to say goodbye. Within just a few days, we got a call from Mr. Hayes, and despite being prepared for the worst, he sounded hopeful. Along with walking the surrounding hills, Mr. Hayes had toured nearby towns and homesteads, showing the locals Jody's picture in the hopes that they might recognize him. And believe it or not, one person did. A part-time checkout girl in a small hardware store said that she was almost certain that he'd stopped by to pick up some construction supplies. After digging through their receipts, they produced evidence that Jody purchased a whole bunch of 2x4s, lattice girders, and batteries and flashlights and concrete and the kind of heavy-duty respirator mask that painters sometimes wear. Hayes ended up asking the store manager what a man might do with the materials like that, and thinking it over for all of 2 seconds, the manager replied, "Either a basement or a tunnel or one or the other." Suddenly it became clear that we'd been looking in the wrong place. The area around the San Carlos Valley is highly irrigated with sandy earth and chalky rock that would have made tunnel digging a colossal effort. However, the terrain further up north, up near Mount Baldy, is much more suited for excavation. Mr. Hayes asked us to give him a few more days to hike around the mountain, and of course we accepted. Then a few days later, he gave us a call. He'd found a well-camouflaged campsite in the pines up near Mount Baldy. It was in a region that had been covered by aerial search teams, but not any of the ground teams. Hayes told us that there were no signs of Jody himself, but plenty of evidence that the camp belonged to him. Inside of a large but well-concealed tent were all those same pseudoscience books regarding ley lines and spiritual energies and weird stuff like that. On top of that, there was almost $2,000 in cash, a stack of military rations, a water purifier, books on covert evasion techniques, and signs that he had been hunting and foraging for food. He'd been living way off the grid for quite some time, and dotted among the evidence of that were dozens of worn-out picks and shovels. My first instinct was to fly there right away so that I could personally aid in the search efforts, but to my surprise, Hayes issued a stark warning to me. Jody had indeed been digging a tunnel, one that appeared to reach deep into the bowels of Mount Baldy, but after briefly exploring it, Hayes had retreated for 2 reasons. Number 1, Jody had most definitely learned to tunnel on the fly, meaning his excavation was far from safe, and number 2, after advancing just 20 or 30 feet into the tunnel, Hayes began to feel lightheaded. And this explained why Jody invested in a respirator. But without properly reinforcing the tunnel, Hayes warned that spending too much time down there would risk both our lives. I heard him loud and clear. It just didn't deter me, because I felt like if I'd done my job as a big brother and stopped him from going down both metaphorical and physical rabbit holes, he wouldn't be missing in the first place. My wife suggested that I simply get back in touch with the local sheriff's department so that they could organize a rescue effort on their end, but I wasn't content to just sit on my butt anymore, trying to save my baby brother's life using nothing but a freaking telephone. So, that's how I ended up driving all the way out to Arizona while picking up the supplies I needed for the task ahead of me. Calder Hayes told me that he'd guide me to the camp, but wouldn't accompany me in the tunnel. He knew he couldn't stop me from going down there, and out of courtesy, He said that he'd hang around to make sure that I made it out okay. But the way he saw it, the tunnel was far too poorly constructed to support even 2 men walking back and forth. It was a dangerous plan, there was no doubt about that, and the smart move was to either splash out on private contractors or to wait for the cops to get back around to organizing another search. But I guess at the time I wasn't in a very smart frame of mind. To me, we'd wasted enough time already, and if Jody was down in that hole, I was going to get him out of it, even if I had to drag him out. It was the morning of August 2nd, 1989, that Mr. Hayes led me up to the foothills of Mount Baldy to where Jody's final abode stood. It was just as raggedy and unkempt as he described, every part of the residence of someone who'd completely lost their mind. Hayes had described how he'd been living off the grid, so to speak, but I didn't really believe it until I saw it for myself. The camp was one thing, but the tunnel, that was another thing entirely. I pictured something at least 5 or 6 feet wide with something resembling standing headroom. The reality was very different. Jody's tunnel was barely wide enough for a grown man to walk down, and if he did so at a crouch. It was very clear that speed and not precision had been the order of the day, with Hayes claiming that if he's dug any further down the valley, he'd have been buried alive before he got 10 feet down. The idea of climbing down there was a distressing one, but not nearly as distressing as the idea of my baby brother toiling day and night in the dust and darkness without me being there to stop him. Once the respirator was securely attached to my face, Hayes unfurled a long length of sturdy-looking climbing cord and told me to wrap it around my waist. When I asked him why, when he had ourselves a pair of shortwave radios, he told me that he called it a weekly county walkie-talkie on account of all the deep caves in that part of Tennessee. After a certain depth, radios would be useless, and if anything happened to me down there, Hayes needed to know about it. So after tying the cord tight around me, I climbed down the rough plank ladder Jody had hammered into the rock and trudged off into the darkness. Of course, the tunnel didn't remain dark for long. My flashlight saw to that, but once it flickered on, I realized the extent of my brother's work. The tunnel extended deep into the earth, almost like a kind of broad staircase, so that from any one place you couldn't really tell how deep it went. I must have walked for a good few minutes, treading deeper and deeper into the mountain before my eyes began to sting. It wasn't an unbearable sensation, something sort of like chopping onions, but it made pushing on much more difficult. As I kept on walking, wiping stinging tears from my eyes with the sleeve of my jacket, until there came a point where the tunnel seemed to open into a sort of vast, pitch-black cavern. When I say vast, I really mean it. There must have been at least 100 yards of darkness on either side of me, swallowing up the beam of my flashlight before it could reach any kind of surface. I remember thinking, Jody sure as hell didn't dig this place out. And after walking a few feet further, I saw the rocky cave floor disappear into a sheer drop. It suddenly made sense why my footsteps seemed to echo so much. The cave was even bigger than I'd first imagined. I carefully crept towards the edge of the precipice, shining my flashlight down into it to try and gauge how deep it went. Again, my already powerful flashlight wasn't sufficient to penetrate darkness of that depth. I tried shouting "Echo" to get an idea of how deep and wide the precipice was, but my respirator made it next to impossible to make enough noise to truly gauge it. And around that same time, I ran my flashlight beam along the edge of the cliff and spotted something sticking out from the rock. It was some piece of climbing equipment, a kind of heavy-duty nail that Jody had hammered into the rock before tying a section of rope around it. The rope then extended over the side of the cliff, and although the prospect terrified me, it was clear that Jody's search for whatever it was had taken him God knows how down into the darkness of the cavern below. And that's when I had an idea. I walked back to the narrow tunnel and picked up a pair of fist-sized rocks. Jody's minimalist approach to housekeeping meant that there were plenty of them around, so with one in each hand, I walked back to the cliff edge and tossed one of the rocks into the abyss. I expected maybe a few seconds of silence before impact. It was clearly a long way down, but there had to be a cavern floor down there somewhere, right? But a few seconds dragged on, and on, and on, until it suddenly hit me that I wasn't going to hear any kind of impact at all. I was hit by this sudden sense of vertigo as I realized that the cavern extended deeper than I ever thought possible. I ran over to where the rope was hitched, pulled it up to see just how far my brother had gotten before he either climbed back up or found his way onto some kind of ledge or tunnel mouth. There must have been 100 feet of rope there, easily, and no signs of breakage or snapping either. So if Jody had fallen, it hadn't been as a result of an accident. Dead or alive, he was down there. He must be. Nothing else makes sense. I remember rushing back to the surface to tell Hayes what I had found. The news surprised him, as he wasn't aware that any such cave system existed in the area. The discovery of new subterranean cave networks isn't entirely uncommon, but the question was, how had Jody figured out where it was? I told Hayes all the stuff that he talked about, regarding ley lines and energies and whatnot, thinking that he might recognize the significance of it. But it didn't. It only confused him further. In fact, I think the one thing Hayes was certain of was the search for Jody just got a whole lot more complicated. He seemed to think that state-run search and rescue teams would be reluctant to act on our new information, and when I spoke to them, I found out why. To put it bluntly, the risk-to-reward ratio was skewed way in favor of risk. Given the amount of time that had passed, there was a good chance that Jody was no longer with us. In which case, and keeping in mind that his digging that had been amateur at best, attempting to retrieve his body would pose an unnecessary risk to rescue workers. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was the truth. Jody had made his choice, and frankly, it's something of a miracle that he'd managed to dig as deep as he did without getting buried alive. Yet there's still a part of me that just doesn't feel like he's gone. And call me crazy, but I think I'd feel it. But instead of that feeling of loss, of grief that my little brother is gone, all I feel is urgency, frustration, and guilt. Jody's still down there in that cave, and by God, I think by some miracle, he's still alive. If I wasn't as old as I am, I'd be down there again, climbing into that abyss, searching for my brother. But seeing as doing so would be as good as eating my gun, I figured that I'd do the next best thing and try handing things off to another, you see. I'm not asking you or your viewers to go putting yourselves in danger or anything like that, I promise. The last thing I want is for any more folks to get hurt. I'm also not convinced that anyone's going to be able to bring Jody home, not in one piece anyway. All I really want to know is what's down in that cave, and why Jody drove himself half mad trying to find it. It's a mystery that's haunted me for more than 30 years now, and before I die, I'd like to see it solved. I just don't want anyone else's brother or son or father to go down there, only to never see the light of day again. If you enjoyed this scary story, listen to thousands more, either over on the Let's Read YouTube channel or podcast.